Writing a scientific paper is difficult for many students and even for some science professionals. Hi, I'm Karen McKee, scientist and author. In this tutorial, I will go through the entire process of writing a scientific paper, explaining what goes into each major section of the manuscript. I will use one of my own published papers to illustrate as we work through each step in the writing process. I should also mention that I'll be going through the major sections of a paper in the order they usually appear, but they are not necessarily written in that order. Some people find it easier to begin writing the methods section or the results. You can even begin with the introduction, especially if you already have some background written, from your research prospectus, for example. Before you begin writing, you must have a clear idea about what your paper is about and why your findings are important. This takes familiarity with your results and your field of study. You will conduct statistics on your data and then organize your results into tables and figures. Examine your data from every angle so that you have a clear picture in your mind of what your findings show. Then you must figure out how your work fits into the existing literature. Review the most relevant and recent papers on your topic and take notes. There will be additional literature that you'll need to cite, but the idea is to get a good overview of the topic and how your work fits in. I'll put a link in the description below to a video that shows how to efficiently read scientific papers. You must also know your target audience, which is the readership of the journal you plan to submit your manuscript to. This paper, which I'll be using throughout this presentation, was published in a journal called Ecological Applications. This journal publishes papers that show how ecological science can be applied to solving environmental problems. This is the aim of the journal and is found on the journal's website. I crafted the paper so that it clearly addressed the aim of this journal. In other words, I identified what ecological topic our paper addressed and articulated why our information was important to solving an environmental problem. You want to do something similar by tailoring your paper to the aim of your target journal. If your work doesn't have a practical application, as ours did, figure out how it moves the field forward by resolving a controversy, revealing an underlying mechanism, or filling in a gap in knowledge. Once you have your target audience and overall message figured out, you can begin writing. Before we move on, let's briefly consider the format of a typical manuscript. Most journals follow this structure or some variation of it. Follow your target journal's author instructions as to the order of a paper's sections. Here I've listed the major sections in the order they typically go in a submitted manuscript. Manuscripts are typically double-spaced with page and line numbers as you see here. Use a traditional font type such as Times New Roman and 12-point font size. Check the instructions to authors to find details about how to format your manuscript for submission. First, let's consider the title page. Here you will list the title of your paper, the authors, and their affiliations. Here is the title page from our manuscript showing the main parts: title, author names, and affiliations, and contact information. You may also need to suggest a running head for the article or other information. The exact format depends on the journal, so check the instructions as to limits on the title length and what author information to include. The title is one of the most important parts of your paper. Successful authors put a lot of thought into crafting their titles because the title of a paper is the single most important factor determining how many people will find and eventually read that paper. If the title sounds uninteresting or not relevant, people, including journal editors and reviewers, will not be excited to read the paper. In general, you want a title that accurately reflects the study and its findings. In this example, we wrote a title that described the ecosystem we studied, where the study took place, and our main finding. Avoid titles that are too broad and do not convey what the study found. For more tips about how to write an effective title, see the link in the description. The abstract is a succinct summary of a paper. Like the title, it should be carefully written because it may be the only part of your paper that is read. Some journals require a specific format with headings. If not, there is a simple structure that, if followed, will produce a good abstract. There are 4 main parts. 1. What problem did you study and why is it important? 2. What methods did you use? 3. What was your key finding? 4. What did you conclude and what is the significance of your finding? In our paper, we began by describing the broad topic addressed. We then identified the ecosystem and process studied. The next sentences spelled out our main objective and described the approach we took to answer this question. The next few sentences described the results. The last 2 sentences explain the practical application of the findings. Along with the abstract are keywords. Select keywords and phrases that people will likely use to search for papers. For more guidance in writing an abstract, see the link in the description. The introduction is the part of your paper where you identify the problem your study addressed and convince the reader that this information will be of value to them. Don't assume the editors, reviewers, and readers will know why your work is important. Tell them in the introduction. Like the abstract, there is a simple formula for structuring the introduction. First, you need to set the stage by introducing the topic. Next, you describe what is known about the topic and point out what is missing. This is the literature review. Here you want to be thorough, but only include literature that is directly relevant. Don't write a history of the topic and include every study conducted since the 18th century. Third, state the aim of your research in the form of questions, objectives, or hypotheses that will be addressed. You end by describing your overall approach and rationale for it. In our paper, we set the stage in the first paragraph by describing the larger topic of how plant communities are organized and how such knowledge leads to better ways to restore disturbed ecosystems. We then explained the process studied and provided examples from other ecosystems. Sources of information are cited in the narrative with author names and dates. The next few paragraphs provided a review of the literature and of the ecosystem we studied and pointed out what information was needed to improve restoration of disturbed habitats. The aim, approach, and rationale were woven together in the next 3 paragraphs. There are other ways to structure the introduction, but however you do it, you must convince the reader that your information will be of value to them. For additional information and examples of how to write the introduction, see the link in the description. The methods section is where you show the reader that you conducted a thorough and rigorous study. Provide sufficient detail so that someone can repeat your experiments, including manufacturer information for equipment and reagent component concentrations. For standard procedures and analyses, you can cite a source paper and describe any modifications you made. The methods section can be divided into subsections with helpful headings: site description or experimental facility, study organism, experimental design, analytical methods, and statistics. This section is typically written in past tense. In our paper, we provided an extensive site description since it was important to tell the reader about the environmental conditions at the study site as well as history of disturbance. We also included a figure showing the location and configuration of the study area. You may have used a special experimental facility or laboratory setup that needs a detailed description. We then described 4 approaches used in our study, each spelled out in a separate subsection with an appropriate heading. Statistical analyses were described in each of the subsections since different statistical tests and comparison procedures were used for each of the 4 tasks. Depending on your material, the statistics might alternatively be described in a separate section. The experimental design was somewhat complicated, so we included a helpful diagram. The figure legend explained how comparisons were made across treatment. If you use equations, provide them in the methods and explain how they were applied. The results section is where you tell the reader how the experiments turned out. At this point, you've prepared graphs, tables, diagrams, and photographs that show the results. Describe which ones are necessary and which ones do not contribute to your take-home message. Just because you measured something doesn't mean you should present those data. Some journals have limits on the number of figures and tables. Present only the ones that answer your main questions. Supportive data can always be provided in supplemental online information. When describing your results, don't point out every blip in the data. Instead, provide summaries of the main patterns and let the reader peruse the figures and tables for details. Avoid using statistical jargon to describe your data. Instead of saying there was a significant interaction between plant species and salinity, which tells the reader nothing about what was found, say, with increasing salinity, growth of species A decreased more than species B. Then provide the supporting statistics in parentheses or in a separate table. Present all relevant results objectively and avoid interpretations, which will be covered in the discussion. In the example paper, the results were divided into 4 subsections comparable to the subsections in the methods. The data were summarized to indicate main patterns. Readers could scrutinize details in the figures. The remainder of the results were presented in a similar manner. Photographs were used to enhance understanding of the data presented. Note that all the figures are understandable without reference to the text. Look at Figure 10. The legend explains in detail what variables are graphed and what is being compared and when. Your goal in writing the discussion is to explain the results to the reader and how your findings agree with or deviate from work reported previously in the literature. Don't just restate the results with a few references to the literature sprinkled here and there. You must interpret the results and back up that interpretation with a reasoned argument and relevant citations. Typically, there will be other work that agrees with your findings. However, you should also acknowledge work that disagrees with yours and discuss why you think there is a difference. Like the introduction, there is a general formula for writing the discussion. There can be variations on this formula, but the discussion should contain these basic parts. First, write a brief overview to remind the reader of the main findings. A critical and detailed analysis of the data, and implications and importance of the work. You also want to point out the limitations of your study. This critique can be woven into the interpretation of the data or given in a separate section. In the example paper, we oriented the reader by briefly describing the process studied and the main finding. The middle of the discussion interpreted the results in terms of 3 mechanisms which are listed in the subheadings. The last part of the discussion focused on the implications of our findings for restoration projects. The latter discussion was essential for publication in this particular journal, focused on application of ecology to solving environmental problems. But in general, end your discussion by pointing out the broader implications of your study and perhaps mention future areas of research. For more information about how to write the discussion, see the link in the description below. In some cases, there is a separate section called Conclusions. Don't just summarize what has already been stated. Here you are expected to put your work into perspective and describe the significance of the findings to the field of study. For more information on how to write the conclusions, see the link in the description below. Next are acknowledgments. This is where you list funding sources and people who help with field or laboratory work or who provided comments on the manuscript. Build your literature cited section as you cite papers in the narrative. Your main concern here is to ensure the citation information is correct. Carefully check for typos and other inaccuracies. Check your target journal instructions as to what format to use. I strongly recommend using a bibliographic application such as EndNote to make this process easier than typing references in by hand. Such software will save you a lot of time and effort. Figures and tables are often appended at the end of the manuscript. Some journals ask for them to be embedded in the text right after their first mention, or they may be uploaded to the journal as separate files. Follow your target journal's instructions. Some journals require a cover letter or answers to a series of questions. A few journals require graphical abstracts. See the link in the description to videos about how to write an effective letter and how to create a graphical abstract. Authors may be asked for a description of their roles in the study and manuscript preparation. List each author's name followed by a list of their contributions such as conceptualization, investigation, writing the original draft, or funding acquisition. The journal may also require a statement spelling out any financial interests or personal relationships that constitute a conflict of interest. Be sure to report any competing interests by you or co-authors. If none, then state that the authors have no known competing interests or personal relationships that could appear to influence the work reported in the paper. Once you have an initial draft, you will need to revise. You will likely have to make several revisions before it's ready to submit. Ask co-authors to use the Track Changes option in Word to make edits or comments. I recommend saving each revision as a separate document in case you need to refer to an earlier version. It's always a good idea to get a review or two from a couple of people before submitting to a journal. You can also post a preprint on a platform that allows other people to comment on your paper. Consider critical comments carefully, especially if more than one person points out the same problem. Carefully proofread the final revision of your manuscript before submitting it. Remove all track changes, author comments, and highlights. Double-check the formatting to ensure it meets your target journal's guidelines. A final recommendation is to create a file folder called Submission, in which you save the final versions of the narrative, figures and tables, cover letter, and any other materials that are submitted to the journal. After your paper is accepted, you will create another file called Revised Submission, in which you will save the revised manuscript, decision letter, peer reviews, and your response to reviewer comments. Keeping your material and revisions well organized is essential, especially if your manuscript is initially rejected. Well, that's an overview of what goes into a scientific paper. As I pointed out in this video, you can find more detailed help writing specific sections elsewhere on this channel. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on other scientific writing tips.